My daughter sobbed when I wanted to give her up, but her criminal past made itself felt. I never wanted children. I used to repeat those words in my head whenever anyone asked me about my future plans. It was almost a mantra, a truth I clung to as fiercely as I could. Growing up, I watched my parents struggle, financially, emotionally, and with the weight of responsibilities that seemed to crush their spirits. They tried to keep things hidden, but I was old enough to notice how they never traveled, never ate at nice restaurants, never took time for themselves. They put everything into me, and as I reached my teen years, I found myself deeply appreciative but equally determined that I'd never lock myself into the stress and heartbreak of motherhood. When I was in my early 20s, I lost my mom to cancer. That loss carved a deep hole in my chest, one that ached whenever I thought of her face or her voice or even her favorite songs. It wasn't just about missing her. It was about seeing how easily life could be taken away. I developed this sort of defensive wall around my emotions, telling myself I wouldn't let anything tie me down. I wanted to travel, to seek out new experiences, to be utterly free. The idea of pregnancy or the idea of raising a little person who would rely on me for every need horrified me. Then I met Mark. He and I were both in our final year of college, juggling part-time jobs, final projects, and the usual swirl of questions about what we would do after we graduated. He was charismatic in a subtle way. He could enter a room and talk to everyone there without seeming desperate for attention. I admired that at first. We took a couple of the same seminars in literature and, over time, ended up doing study sessions together in the library. It was never romantic, at least not in the storybook sense. We had an easy flirtation, a shared sense of humor. When we finished our study sessions, we'd go get coffee or maybe a cheap meal off campus, and we'd laugh about our professors or the bizarre campus drama swirling around us. In those small interactions, I felt comfortable, and for a long time, that was enough. Eventually, he suggested we might have something casual. The idea appealed to me. Neither of us wanted to commit to a relationship. We were busy, uncertain about our futures, and we liked each other well enough to keep each other's company in bed once in a while. It wasn't serious, and we promised each other it would never become serious. It was a perfect arrangement. I got a physical closeness that I sometimes craved without all the emotional demands that I knew I couldn't fulfill. We used protection, I was on birth control, and we used condoms. It felt safe enough. I never even considered the idea that something could slip through the cracks. The night I realized my period was late, I tried not to panic. I told myself it was stress. Finals were looming, I was working extra shifts at a local cafe, and I was still grieving my mom. My hormones could have been a little off. But day by day, the dread built. I was counting each date on the calendar in the cramped bedroom I rented in a shared house near campus. On a Thursday, I stopped by the pharmacy on my way home from work, buying a pregnancy test and stuffing it into my backpack like it was contraband. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed, gazing at the closed bathroom door, unable to muster the courage to go in. Finally, I forced myself to do it. When the test showed 2 blue lines, my legs buckled beneath. I remember sliding to the floor, pressing my back against the cold bathroom tile. My head swirled. It felt like the walls were spinning, and I couldn't hear anything but the wild thumping of my heart. I told Mark 2 days later. He came over one evening under the pretense that we'd watch a movie together. Instead, he found me in tears, struggling to steady my voice. He looked so calm at first, then all the color drained from his face as the weight of my words sank in. I waited for him to say something. He finally breathed out, "Okay, we'll figure this out," in a voice that was somehow both panicked and determined. We discussed what we would do. To me, options were clear: abortion, adoption, or some arrangement where he'd keep the baby if he truly wanted it. I couldn't imagine myself being a mother, ever. I made that part crystal clear. At first, Mark seemed open to discussing everything rationally, but within a day, he flipped. He started talking about getting married, about how we could be a family, about how he had always pictured himself as a dad someday, and maybe this was fate telling us it was time to grow up. I felt sick. It was like I was being dragged underwater, away from the life I'd fought to maintain. He started confiding in his parents behind my back. I didn't realize it at first, but soon I was getting phone calls from unknown numbers. People left messages telling me I was making a mistake, that I just needed more support, that God was blessing us with a miracle. Then Mark's mom and dad came into the cafe where I worked and asked if we could speak. That conversation felt surreal. They told me they wanted to help, that they'd support me, that their son was a good man who'd always dreamed of having kids. I sat there feeling numb. I wanted them to leave. Part of me wanted to shout that they had no right to ambush me like this, but my tongue felt tied. They weren't being overtly cruel, but they were relentless, talking about how I shouldn't end my pregnancy or put their grandchild up for adoption. It was guilt and pressure, all wrapped together in a suffocating bow. I was grieving my mother, trying to keep up with exams, and dealing with a best friend who was having her own life crisis. I was tapped out emotionally. I could barely wake up in the morning without crying. Every day was a struggle, and I just didn't have the stamina to push back with the energy I should have. So I caved. I told Mark and his parents that I wouldn't abort the baby, but I was firm that I wouldn't marry him. I told them that if I had the baby, There had to be an understanding that I wasn't going to become the perfect mother, or give up all my ambitions, or do anything else that made me resent the whole situation more than I already did. They said they understood. They said they'd handle everything. Yet, even as they said it, I could see the apprehension in their eyes, like they knew I was a flight risk. The pregnancy was miserable. Some people talk about a glow, about excitement. I felt none of that. I visited my doctor, took prenatal vitamins, went to checkups, but I did it all resentfully, as though it was an exhausting chore. The worst part was that Mark tried so hard to be sweet, to be caring. He'd send me texts about baby names, articles on how to handle morning sickness, all these little gestures that just made me recoil further. I tried to appreciate his effort, but deep down, I hated every second of it. Sometimes I'd lie in bed at night, pressing my hands against my belly, wondering how it was possible to feel so disconnected from something literally growing inside me. Maybe that was the first sign that I'd never bond with my child. I had no illusions of a motherly awakening. When our daughter was born, Mark's family rejoiced, and Mark himself was in tears, thanking me, kissing my forehead. I just stared at Abby, all wrinkled and small, trying to summon the maternal love that so many moms said they experienced instantly. It didn't come. I tried to feign warmth when I held her, but I felt numb. My entire body was trembling from labor, and the nurses thought I was overwhelmed with emotion in a sweet, new mother way. In reality, I was overwhelmed by how trapped I felt. That tiny baby was mine, legally and biologically, but I wanted to push her away. I told myself I was a monster for feeling that way. The guilt started that day, and it's never truly left. In the months that followed, Mark tried to get me to move in with him. I refused. I still had classes to finish, even though I took a break from my postpartum recovery. He offered to drop out for a semester if I wanted to keep going right away. His mother offered to come live with us so we could all be a family. Every time they tried to close that net around me, I found a way to slip through. I ended up moving to a small studio apartment in the city once I found some steady work after graduation. I told Mark I wanted to share custody. He was confused at first. Why didn't I want to be more hands-on? But he agreed. We ended up with a strange arrangement where Abby spent most weekdays with him, and weekends with me, so I could focus on my new job. I picked her up Friday nights, dropped her off Sunday evenings, and that was that. People who learned of our situation sometimes shook their heads in judgment, but I was past caring. I told them I was working on my career, or that Mark's home was bigger and more comfortable for a child. Part of that was true, but mostly I just couldn't handle the day-to-day demands of motherhood. Fast forward 5, Abby turned 5 in April. The first time she called me mommy, I remember feeling such shame because I wish she wouldn't. She was a bright, curious child, always wanting to share the littlest details of her day. She'd rush to me on Friday nights with some drawing she made in preschool, or a story about a friend she played with, or a question about something she noticed in the world, and I would smile and nod and sometimes even pick her up for a hug. But behind my eyes, I felt cold. She deserved so much more than I could give. I'd watch her play with crayons or watch cartoons on my TV, and I'd feel like an imposter in my own home. One evening, I was sorting laundry in my apartment's tiny living room, and I realized that the pajamas Abby had been wearing were all covered in chocolate ice cream stains. She had tried to clean them herself, not wanting me to be upset. I guess she saw me cringe whenever things were messy. She was only 4 at the time, but she'd already learned to be cautious around me. When I saw how carefully she tried to fold her pajamas and put them away, I was overcome by a wave of guilt so intense, it felt like I was drowning. This little girl was tiptoeing around me, afraid to provoke my irritation or my anger. That night, after putting her to bed on the pull-out couch, I sat in my own bedroom and cried quietly into my hands, feeling like the worst human being. I wanted so desperately not to be a mother, but there I was, failing the one child who called me mom. At times, Abby would draw little pictures. She was always doodling in bright crayons. Pictures of me and Mark, pictures of her grandparents, pictures of the cartoon characters she liked. One weekend, she proudly showed me a drawing of me and Mark holding hands, with her in the middle, as though we were a happy family. She was beaming from ear to ear. In that moment, I couldn't handle it. I felt my chest tighten and I snapped at her, yelling something like, "Don't do that! Don't draw me and Daddy together!" Her face collapsed. Tears started streaming down her cheeks. She was confused and terrified. I tried to backpedal and apologize, but the damage was done. She didn't understand why I was angry. Neither did I, really. It was just seeing that vision of a perfect family, something I knew I'd never be able to give her, that made me lash out. That was the day I started thinking seriously about giving up my parental rights altogether. If I couldn't love, if I was so consumed by resentment, maybe it would be better for Abby to be raised solely by Mark. He at least seemed to genuinely love her. He had a stable job, a bigger apartment, and supportive parents who doted on. Meanwhile, I was living in a studio, working odd hours, and burying myself in a routine that barely allowed me to see any friends. I spent many nights staring at the sea, fantasizing about the freedom I would have if I just signed away custody. But each time I pictured actually going through with it, an avalanche of guilt crushed. Abby wasn't a pet you could rehome. She was a little girl who wanted her mother. As time passed, my mental health deteriorated. I felt stuck in a life I'd never wanted. Yet, ironically, Abby was growing into a sweet, well-behaved child who rarely threw tantrums, who was polite to strangers, who didn't demand fancy toys or constant attention. She always tried to make me proud in small ways, like cleaning up her crayons after she finished drawing, or trying to help me fold laundry, or offering to carry groceries from the car. The fact that she was such a good kid only heightened my guilt, because I couldn't bring myself to show her the warmth she deserved. It's a terrible feeling to look at your own child's innocent face and feel mostly regret. Finally, during a particularly low moment, I told Mark I wanted to alter our custody arrangement, and that I was seriously considering relinquishing my rights. I phrased it clumsily because I didn't know how to say the words without sounding cruel. I just explained that it hurt, that I felt I was doing more harm than good, that maybe Abby would be better off if she just stayed with him permanently. Mark was stunned. His voice trembled when he asked, "What's really going on? Why now?" I couldn't give him a neat answer. I only repeated, "I'm not cut out for this." The next few days, he sent me a flood of messages, both texts and voicemails, insisting we could work this out, telling me not to do anything drastic. Then, one Friday, he called me, which we usually only did for emergencies. He was panicked, begging me to come over because Abby was inconsolable. I'd never heard him sound that distressed, so I raced to his place. As soon as I walked in, Abby latched onto my leg, her face red and puffy from crying. She screamed, "Don't leave me! Why are you leaving me? I didn't do anything wrong." She shook with sobs that racked her entire body. I froze, mortified, looking at Mark in confusion. That's when he explained that his mother had told Abby, in a moment of anger or frustration, that I was planning to go away forever, that I didn't want to see her any. Hearing this, Abby spiraled into a hysterical meltdown, convinced that her mother wanted to abandon her completely. In that instant, all my carefully constructed barriers fell apart. Seeing Abby's absolute terror, hearing her pleading with me, shattered me in a way I hadn't thought possible. I scooped her into my arms, feeling her cling to me so tightly I could hardly breathe. She just kept sobbing, "Please, Mommy, don't go. Please stay with me." My eyes burned with tears as I tried to reassure her, though I couldn't find the right words. Mark stood by, looking helpless. Eventually, he decided to bring Abby to my apartment earlier than usual, hoping that my presence would calm her. She clung to me in the backseat of his car the entire ride, refusing to let go. That night, Mark ended up staying over at my place because Abby refused to be more than a few feet away from me. It was surreal. We'd never shared such close quarters as a family, yet there we were in my cramped studio, me on one side of the bed, Abby between us, and Mark on the other side, all wearing our clothes because none of us had planned for this arrangement. I was wide awake for most of the night, listening to Abby's breathing slow as she drifted to sleep, feeling the heat of her small body next to mine. Mark was awake too, though we didn't speak much. Every now and then, I heard him stir or sigh quietly in the darkness. In the morning, the tension remained, but at least Abby seemed calmer, though still fragile. She stuck to my side like glue, as if afraid that if she let me out of her sight, I'd disappear forever. Mark made us all breakfast in my tiny kitchenette, and we silently ate, the only sound being the scrape of forks on plates. Later that day, he admitted he was furious at his mother for telling Abby about my potential plan to give up custody. I couldn't entirely blame her for the meltdown. Part of me felt it was my fault for even voicing the idea. Yet I also felt betrayal, since it was up to me, not her, to talk to Abby about such a complicated matter. In the aftermath, I realized I couldn't go through with relinquishing my parental rights. I didn't have it in me to shatter Abby's heart like that. Seeing her tears and fear had cut me too deep, but this left me in a terrible limbo. I didn't want to be a mother, but I couldn't abandon my daughter either. It was like a nightmare, one in which any path I chose led to regret. So I decided the least I could do was get therapy, and maybe encourage the same for Abby, because she was clearly shaken by what she'd heard. Mark's initial reaction was to say that Abby seemed fine once she calmed down, so maybe therapy wasn't necessary. But I insisted. We found someone local, a child psychologist who specialized in anxiety and attachment. Abby started going once a week, and after a couple of months, it seemed to help. She became less clingy, though she remained more aware of my presence. She would still reach for my hand at random times, almost as if she wanted to confirm that I was real, that I was there. Each time, I forced myself to lace my fingers through hers, ignoring the part of me that squirmed at the contact. I knew I had to try for her sake. Meanwhile, I looked into online therapy for myself. I wasn't sure if I could handle in-person sessions. The idea of sitting across from a counselor, explaining how I resented my own child, was too embarrassing. So I opted for video sessions, hoping that the slight distance of a screen might make it easier for me to talk. In the beginning, I found myself glossing over the worst details, trying to present my situation as more of a mild postpartum depression that never resolved. But as the weeks went by and as I got more comfortable with the therapist, I finally admitted the real depth of my feelings. I told her how I'd never wanted Abby, how I felt no love for her, how I'd actually contemplated cutting ties entirely. It was excruciating to hear myself say those truths out loud, but a strange relief washed over me afterward. My therapist didn't recoil in horror. She acknowledged my guilt and pain, and encouraged me to keep exploring why I felt that way and whether those feelings could change. During one of our sessions, she asked me to recall my earliest memories of my mother. I talked about how she always worked hard, how she was there for me even when she was exhausted, and how I never once doubted her love. Despite all our financial stress, She tried to give me a warm childhood. The therapist asked me if I thought my mom had ever struggled with her own doubts. The question surprised me. I'd never considered that my mother might have had her own regrets or resentments. We tend to see our parents as these unwavering figures. The therapist pointed out that some parents hide their struggles, and sometimes children never know how overwhelmed or unhappy their parents felt. That gave me a shred of hope. Perhaps it was possible to keep my complicated emotions inside while still doing my best to provide some version of maternal care. But was that healthy for me or for Abby? Meanwhile, Mark and I settled into a more frequent communication pattern, mostly about Abby's therapy, her progress in school, her friendships. We kept it strictly about her, but I sensed a gentle thawing in our dynamic. He often apologized for having pushed me so hard when I was pregnant. He would say, "I know you never wanted this. I wish I had handled things different, but I love Abby, and I can't imagine life without her." I never quite knew how to respond because our regrets were so deeply intertwined. Sometimes he'd stay over on weekends if Abby asked him to. He slept on the couch usually. A few times, she wanted us both to tuck her into bed, so we'd stand on either side of her little mattress, reading her a bedtime story. In those fleeting moments, I almost felt like we were a real family, a tiny spark of connection forming in the darkness. But as soon as Abby was asleep, Mark and I would drift into awkward silence. Months passed in this tentative truce. My therapy continued, and Abby's therapy became less frequent as the psychologist said she was doing better, showing signs of emotional stability. She got over her intense fear of abandonment, or at least she learned to manage it. She started telling me about her day again, pointing excitedly at cartoon characters on the TV screen and explaining their backstories, or showing me the new dance moves she learned in her extracurricular program. I forced myself to engage, to ask questions, to show an interest. Sometimes I even found a spark of real enjoyment. Her laughter was contagious, the same way a bright, unexpected sunrise can lift your spirits before you can fully question why. I was slowly, hesitant, stepping into the role of mom, but it still felt like I was borrowing someone else's life. I started noticing small details about Abby that I'd never bothered to see before. She was surprisingly good at puzzles. She had a knack for noticing patterns, fitting pieces together with a patient determination that I never had. She was obsessed with octopuses for some strange reason, rattling off random facts she gleaned from library books or kid-friendly documentaries. She said she wanted to see a real octopus someday at a big aquarium. I mused about maybe taking her on a trip to the city's aquarium one weekend. When I mentioned the idea, her entire face lit up. She jumped in excitement, hugging me around the waist. That simple reaction left me both warm and unsettled. Part of me was relieved that I could give her a moment of genuine happiness. Part of me was terrified that I'd somehow fail her again. The weekends slowly shifted in tone. I started letting her help in the kitchen, first by letting her watch me stir the pot or measure ingredients, then by allowing her to do small tasks like washing vegetables. I remembered how my own mom had taught me the basics of cooking, and a pang of longing for those days hit. Abby seemed so proud of herself whenever she helped. She'd look at me expectantly, wanting me to notice how she was contributing. I'd force a smile, nod, and say, "Good job," hoping she couldn't detect the artificial cheer. Over time, though, it became less. I started asking her opinion. Should we add more salt? Or which spices should we try? She'd giggle and point to random jars, half of which I knew she'd never tasted. It became a small bonding ritual, and I found it less excruciating than I'd feared. At times, Mark would come over to spend Sunday with us, and Abby would be ecstatic. She'd sit at the kitchen table, coloring or assembling puzzles, while Mark and I made idle chatter about our jobs, the cost of groceries, or how Abby was doing in school. There was a sadness in his eyes whenever he looked at me, maybe a sadness that we hadn't found a way to be a real family from the start. But he never pressured me again to be anything other than what I was. If Abby asked him to stay the night, he'd look at me uncertainly, and I'd nod if it felt okay. Sometimes he slept on the couch. Sometimes I let him take my bed while I dozed in a sleeping bag on the floor with Abby. It was messy, but it was an arrangement that worked for us. One day, Abby showed me a new drawing. It was of me, her, and Mark. We were all standing outside of my apartment building, but this time, I noticed something different. We weren't holding hands. In fact, she drew a slight gap between me and Mark, as if she'd sensed the distance between us. Yet she was smiling in the picture, and so were we. It stung my heart to see it. I asked, lightly, "What's happening here?" She beamed and said, "We're picking flowers." In the picture, all three of us had crude little outlines of red flowers in our hands. I realized she was imagining a simple moment of shared happiness. I pulled her into a gentle hug, pressing my cheek against the top of her head. My therapist would have been proud. I was managing a small, honest demonstration of affection. Still, I had nights when I thought about running, about buying a plane ticket to anywhere else. I'd dream about moving far away, starting a new job, renting a little studio all my own, free of obligations. But each time, Abby's tear-streaked face flashed in my mind, or I'd recall how she asked me that very day to show her how to fold origami animals, or how she was so excited to show me a dance she learned. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me again, reminding me that it wouldn't be just my life I was severing. It would be her sense of stability, too. Eventually, my therapist started honing in on the question of whether I could learn to accept motherhood as part of my identity. We talked about how some people never feel that magical rush of maternal love, but they do manage to care for their children in a way that fosters growth and security. She said that for many, love is an action, a choice you make every day. It's the time you spend helping them with homework, the dinners you cook, the comfort you give when they scrape their knee. Sometimes the feelings follow the actions rather than preceding. That idea gave me cautious hope. Maybe I wouldn't wake up one day with a sudden flood of motherly devotion, but perhaps, by going through the motions and continuing to try, I could create a bond with Abby that neither of us would regret. Abby turned 6 recently. We had a small celebration at Mark's apartment. I brought a homemade cake, which was the first time in my life I'd ever baked one from scratch. Abby helped me with it the night before, giggling as flour poofed into the air. We ended up with the kitchen covered in white dust, but she had so much fun that I didn't even mind cleaning up afterward. At her birthday, she had a couple of her little friends there, along with Mark's parents and a few family friends. I stayed near the corner of the room at first, observing, feeling oddly out of place as Mark's mom guided the kids through party games. She shot me guarded looks. Our relationship was irreparably strained, but at least she wasn't antagonizing me openly. I guess we had a silent truce for Abby's sake. Mark hovered between the kids and trying to keep the peace. Abby opened her presents, squealing with delight whenever she discovered a new puzzle or coloring set. She showed them all to me, her eyes shining. I forced a bright smile, telling her how wonderful each gift was. Part of me felt like an actor in a play, but another part of me was relieved that I was there for her, even if it was awkward. Later, after everyone left and the apartment was quiet except for Mark, me, and Abby, she tugged on my sleeve and pointed to her new puzzle. We sat on the floor and worked on it together while Mark watched from the couch, occasionally offering a stray piece if Abby got stuck. Her small fingers methodically tried each piece until it slid into place with a satisfying click. When we finished, she glanced at me and asked, "Mommy, are you happy?" The question startled me. I hesitated, then said, "I'm happy we finished the puzzle," but she shook her head and clarified, "No, I mean, are you happy with me?" I felt a lump forming in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Mark, noticing the tension, started to say something, but I lifted a hand to stop him. I looked at Abby's searching eyes and, in perhaps my most honest moment with her, answered, "I'm happy you're here, and I'm trying really hard to be the best mommy I can be." She nodded, seeming to accept that. Then she hugged me, and despite my usual awkwardness with displays of affection, I found myself hugging her back firmly. Mark turned his face away, possibly to hide the emotion welling up in his eye. That night, I realized I had reached a turning. I still didn't feel like a natural mother. I might never, but I had to try to be present for Abby in some meaningful way. And so I kept going to therapy, practicing small acts of connection, and inviting her to share in my interests too. I started showing her some of the music I listened to. Soft rock, old pop songs. She would sway to the tunes, laughing at the weird album covers. Sometimes we'd dance around my apartment, which had become more of a 2-bedroom now that I'd managed to move and upgrade my living space. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I've come to realize that motherhood is not one size fits all. Some women feel that maternal instinct from the start. Some grow into it. Some never quite get there. I spent years feeling like a bad person because I didn't love my child the way society said I should. And maybe I was a bad person for not wanting, for resenting her existence. But I'm here now, trying to make up for it in little ways, day by day. Abby deserves at least that. She deserves honesty, kindness, and stability. Even if my heart doesn't swell with an overpowering maternal love, I can still offer her a structured life, a space to feel safe, and a listening ear when she wants to chat. I don't know what the future holds for us. Sometimes I still catch myself daydreaming about running off to a foreign country, sleeping in a hostel by the beach, free from responsibility. But then I think about Abby's next puzzle, or how excited she'll be to learn a new recipe, or what new facts about octopuses she'll tell me, and something in me loosens. Maybe that's a glimmer of maternal love. Maybe it's just empathy for a child who wants to belong. Either way, it's enough to keep me. I haven't resumed a romantic relationship with Mark, nor do I see that happening. There's too much history, too many regrets, too many attempts to mold me into someone I wasn't ready to be. We're cordial, though. We text about Abby. We share pictures of her at events. We coordinate schedules so she can enjoy both of us in her life. His mother is still in the picture, though more cautiously so. She apologized to me once, not directly for what she did, but for any pain caused by the situation. I didn't say much in response, just nodded. Maybe time will ease that tension too, but for now, we maintain a polite distance. As for Abby, she's thriving. She loves art, dancing, puzzles, and apparently everything about marine life. She says she wants to be a scientist who explores the ocean and befriends octopuses. Maybe she'll do just that one day. She's not as clingy anymore, But she does still reach for my hand sometimes when she's unsure. We watch cartoons together. She explains the plots in an animated voice that I try my best to follow. I still attend therapy and I'm learning not to hate myself for the long road it took me to get here. My therapist tells me that remorse for the past doesn't have to define my future. She encourages me to acknowledge each small step forward as a victim. I'm writing all of this because I need to remember it happened. I need to remind myself how far I've come and how far I still have to go. There might be people out there who judge me harshly for my initial resentment, who think a mother should love her child unconditionally from day one. But life isn't always so neat. Sometimes we're thrown into roles we never wanted, and we spend years stumbling through, making mistakes. If nothing else, I hope my mistakes can serve as a cautionary tale for someone else in a similar situation, or maybe as a reminder that it's possible to build a bond with your child, even if it isn't the bond you expected. I once thought the only way to escape my pain was to run, but running would have meant abandoning Abby to the same sense of loss I felt when my own mother died. That wasn't a fate I could allow for, so I stayed, even though I didn't have a roadmap for motherhood, even though my heart felt hollow at times. And bit by bit, day by day, I found small moments of warmth. I'm nowhere near perfect. I still have flashes of resentment or longing for the child-free life I had envisioned. But I'm also finding that maybe there's more to this motherhood thing than I realized. It's not black and white, love or hate. It's messy, complicated, beautiful in small flashes, and excruciating in others. Maybe that's all parenthood is for everyone, one step at a time. No guarantees, no perfect endings, just a constant attempt to give a child a chance to be happy. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe as Abby grows, she'll notice my emotional distance and we'll have painful conversations about it later. Maybe she'll decide to resent me for the years I wasn't fully present. Or maybe she'll appreciate that I tried in the end to stay in her life. I guess only time will tell. But this is where I am right now, in this fragile truce with my own motherhood, and with a quiet hope that Abby continues to flourish. And for now, that's enough. I don't need a perfect story. I just need a real one, day by day, with a child who's learning that her mother is trying her best, even if her best has been uneven and flawed. And maybe that's the only kind of redemption I can hope.